Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. And I just want to give you another quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means any gifts that you give us are tax deductible. So we would ask that you consider becoming a contributor to the work that we do. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page there, and you can help us out. And we do really appreciate and need your gifts to continue to do what we do. Now, today we're going to be continuing our study of Christology. And we're going through Revere Franklin Widener's book, Christology, or the Doctrine of the Person of Christ. If you want to pick up a copy of this book, you can go to jspublishing.org and you can get yourself a copy. This will also be published as our Volume 2, which is coming out soon, of Widener's Dogmatics. And that's a hardcover volume that has multiple of these volumes within it. But if you want to pick up a copy now, what we have is the paperback version. So we've been going through this study of Christology, delving into a lot of patristic Christology, so looking at what the Church Fathers said about the doctrine of Christ and how we understand his two natures and the relationship between the two natures. And last time we discussed the Council of Chalcedon. And the Council of Chalcedon met to put an end to a lot of the debates that were currently or then happening in the church. And those debates had to do with the question of whether Jesus was two persons or one person, whether Jesus had two natures or one singular nature. And it solved the issue of Nestorianism on the one hand, which is the doctrine of Nestorius, which still exists today, by the way, in the Assyrian Church of the East. And the Nestorian position essentially says that Jesus is two persons. There's a divine person and a human person. Now, that's a bit simplistic in terms of what Nestorius actually taught, but you can watch the last or listen to the last program to get more details there. And on the other hand, you had the perspective known as Eutychianism. Now, Eutychianism, often called Monophysitism. Monophysitism is actually the broader term, but Eutyches was one thinker under the broader term Monophysitism. Eutychius taught essentially that there is an absorption of the human nature of Christ into the divine nature to create one nature. And it's kind of dissolved into, he talks about like one drop of oil being dropped into the ocean, with the drop of oil being the humanity and into the infinite ocean of divinity. So basically, while, the humanity is still there, it's kind of absorbed into the divinity. So those positions are rejected at the Council of Chalcedon. So Chalcedon makes a number of qualifications. We talked about the Tome of Leo. Leo's tome, who was the Pope at the time, the Bishop of Rome at the time, writes this letter which expands upon how the two natures are related. And the relationship between the two natures at this point is not expounded so much positively, but in terms of what it's not. So we're setting the boundaries around which Christian orthodoxy can be discussed. So we say two natures, not one nature, one person, not two persons, but then we say without division and without confusion, without absorption of the humanity into the divinity. So those categories, those ways of speaking about the relationship between the two natures in Christ, those are rejected, and so we say that we cannot speak in those terms. Now, the Council of Chalcedon did not solve all of the Christological issues. So it's not like this is an end to the debates in Christology in the early church, much like the Council of Nicaea, though it made a definitive decision against Arianism in favor of what we now consider to be Nicene Orthodoxy, the doctrine that was that of Alexander and later more often associated with Athanasius, who's his student who defends the Council of Nicaea. So the decision of Nicaea doesn't end all debate. There's still plenty of debate about whether the council is right or wrong, and then they also have to work out the particulars of what exactly that means. So we have the same thing happening after Chalcedon. So on the one hand, there are those groups that are still rejecting the Council of Chalcedon and the formulations that we find there. These are what are often referred to as the non-Chalcedonian churches, even today. So if you look at the Oriental Orthodox churches, you look at the Coptic church in Egypt, say, or the Ethiopian church, those churches still reject the definition of Chalcedon. Now, so they clearly haven't been stamped out, right? It hasn't meant that there is no, there's no division over these issues anymore. Everyone didn't just come to an agreement after Chalcedon. But after the decision was made at Chalcedon, it did for a large portion of the church give a definitive explanation of what the boundaries around orthodoxy are. And you still have, however, as I said, these other churches that actually have rejected Chalcedon, and you still have the problem that exists in the Byzantine Empire. So at this time, the Western Roman Empire is falling, and things have kind of fallen apart and fragmented. But in the East, the Roman Empire really becomes what we know as the Byzantine Empire, sometimes just called the Eastern Roman Empire, and they certainly consider themselves a continuation of the Roman Empire, but usually we refer to them as the Byzantine Empire. And these Christological debates really significantly impacted the East, the Byzantine Empire, because you have still these very significant divisions of the peoples in the empire between the churches that are generally considered Monophysites. We could talk about Miaphysite churches, by the way. So if you think about the Coptic Church today, there have been a lot of dialogues and discussions, especially in the last 100 years, with the Coptic Church. And it has been understood through a lot of those dialogues that the Coptic Church does not actually hold on to what we would call Monophysitism. So the notion that you find in someone like Eutychius, that there is this total absorption of the humanity into the divinity, so that there is kind of this third thing made that's mostly divinity, but not humanity, that is actually rejected by the Coptic churches. So when it's said that they're non-Chalcedonian, we're not really talking about churches that adopt the ideas of Eutychius. It's come across in a lot of the discussions in more recent years that the Copts very clearly affirm the fullness of the humanity of Christ, the fullness of the divinity of Christ, but speak about the fullness of divinity and the fullness of humanity in one human divine nature. And so the question that has been brought up in more recent years is there a real substantial difference between what's going on here, or is it really more of a terminological distinction? Is it that they're using person in a sense that we generally speak, essence in a sense that we speak generally about person? Because they are still holding on to the integrity of both the divinity and the humanity without some kind of absorption of one into the other. And here they're really showing that they are followers of Cyril of Alexandria, which the various Monophysite and non-Chalcedonian parties claimed that they were following Cyril of Alexandria. And Cyril of Alexandria has generally been considered very much an Orthodox theologian, even though he speaks about one nature, because we have to look at the essence of what he's talking about behind the terminology. So it's generally understood that Cyril is one of the real stalwarts of Christological orthodoxy in the ancient church, opponent of Nestorianism, but that Chalcedon and some development that happened later helped us now to distinguish between what we mean by person and natures. So I at least the little that I've done in terms of reading of the Copts, I don't see a substantial theological difference between what we would consider to be an Orthodox Christological view, which upholds the integrity of the two natures, and in the Coptic view. It seems that a lot of the issues are just as much political and terminological as they are anything else. And we see this in the post-Chalcedonian church, is that there was very much a concern that Chalcedon essentially ceded to the Nestorians. You know, they used language that sounded too Nestorian. And, you know, I don't think Chalcedon was Nestorian, but that's how some of the followers of Cyril read Chalcedon, because of the terminology and context that they had, and the battle that Cyril had fought against the Nestorians. They tend to see that as the ultimate enemy, and so they're not really looking too much at what is the error on the other side of someone like Eutychius. But I think it's clear that the error of Eutychius is not one that is repeated today in the Coptic churches. So then this leads us to the doctrinal controversy that we're going to be talking about today. And when we're talking about Christological errors, Christological heresies, this one doesn't tend to show up quite as much as some of the other ones. And I think part of the reason is it's very subtle. The distinction is far more, I think, subtle and nuanced than many of the others. Because if you're looking at something like Arianism, which says that the Son was actually created and is not divine, at least in the fullest sense divine, the error seems very obvious, right? The distinction between that and a view that says, no, Christ is not only pre-existent, but he is always existent. He's existent always with the Father. He is of an equal substance with the Father. That distinction becomes a lot more obvious. Or if you say something like, well, does Christ have two natures? Is he human and divine? Or is there an absorption of divinity into humanity so it kind of disappears? That seems a lot more straightforward. But we get into a more nuanced debate that happens in specifically the Eastern Empire, that we're going to see that the West does, at least the Pope at the time, the Bishop of Rome at the time, does get involved. And there is a concern in the Byzantine Empire about the division that is happening between these two groups, so the Chalcedonian group and the non-Chalcedonian group. This is very similar to Constantine's concern at the Council of Nicaea. You know, Constantine is not a theologian. He is the emperor of Rome. He is a Christian emperor, and he sees that the empire is hurting itself, and as an emperor would be and should be concerned about the division of his empire, he wants this to be solved. So he's like, figure out the theological stuff. We're going to make a council, call a bunch of bishops, and you guys figure this out and then unite and stop fighting. It's going to hurt the empire. So the Byzantine Empire has a similar issue. And so the emperor at the time, he proposes, and so in the East at this time, you have the five patriarchates in the East, and you have then the Bishop of Rome in the West, which, you know, still exists today. And of those five, three of them affirmed what comes to be known as, well, they're kind of two different errors that are very similar. One is monoenergism, or energism, and then the other is monothelitism. So of the patriarchates, 3 out of the 5 adopt one of these positions, which end up then being rejected as Christological heresies. Okay, so what is that? What are we talking about? How does this develop? What's going on? Well, the emperor proposes that there has to be a way to mediate between these parties. So he's seeing that there are concerns of Nestorianism on the part of the non-Chalcedonian churches. And so he wants to ease tensions here. And so he says, maybe there's some kind of compromise we can make. Maybe there is some kind of clarification that we can make to Chalcedon and the Chalcedonian definition, which would satisfy the other side. So it's very obvious at this point. This is one of these theological debates that's very clearly an attempt to compromise. It's very clearly an attempt to solve a political situation. Which, theological debates, it would be great to say, oh, it's all just people concerned about the truth and just looking at Scripture objectively, trying to find the truth. But hey, the reality of history is there's a lot of politics involved because that's life and that's the world. So there are just the real world consequences, the politics. The fact is, this is an empire that's divided over the theological issues. And when that happens, you've got pressure to fix it. Right. So that is often what leads to the solving of theological debates is a political necessity. I mean, read Luther in the situation at the Reformation. Politics plays as significant of a role in the Reformation than theology does, really. That's just how the world functions and works. And the same thing is really true of Nicaea as well, as you read a lot of the history. By the way, there's a great book that I'm currently reading through. It's by Khaled Anatolios. I'm probably totally mispronouncing that, and I apologize to the author for doing that. But he has a book called Retrieving Nicaea that is a wonderful history of Nicene orthodoxy and how those ideas develop, which is it's very helpful in providing a lot of context politically and ideologically, philosophically, and theologically. So if you want to delve into some of these Christological issues in more depth, I highly recommend that volume, which has been praised enough. And I mean, it's been cited in all sorts of works today. It's kind of it seems like it's becoming a bit of a standard text. That's been very helpful. So you have this political division, And so the first solution that's proposed is, well, maybe we can ease the concerns of the non-Chalcedonian churches if we start to say that, yeah, there are two natures, but there's one energy in Christ. And the language of energy, if you're familiar with Eastern Orthodox theology, you know that language of energy is pretty significant within the development of Eastern theology. So we speak about the distinction between God's essence and God's energies in the Eastern Church. So the distinction between God's essence is what he is in himself. The energies are like the workings of God. The analogy that's usually used is, it's like the sun and its rays, right? The rays are not separate from the sun, but they are the outworkings of the sun, the shining forth of the sun. And that's how this essence energies distinction works. But we're talking essentially about one power that is working through the person, through the two natures. So it's an attempt to say, well, there's one working, not that there is one nature, but maybe we can say, if we say there's two natures, but one energy, one power, maybe they'll recognize in these churches that we're not talking about the Nestorian error, and they'll see that, and then they'll realize, okay, maybe Chalcedon, if these concessions are made, is actually not that bad. Now, this position ends up getting rejected by the majority, but it's accepted by some. And there is a second proposal. So the second proposal, first we have language of one energy, which at least by many is rejected. And then the second proposal is that maybe we don't speak of one energy, but we speak instead of one will. Now, what you see in Widener's text here, and I'm on page 40 and 41 if you have our edition, Widener actually does kind of conflate these two ideas as if they are one, and they kind of are in some ways, but they are also offered as separate proposals. So let me just read what he says on page 40. He says, the Monothelites owe their origin to an attempt to bridge over the differences between the Orthodox position based on the decrees of the Council of Chalcedon and the Monophysite principles, which had caused a schism in the Eastern Church. Monothelitism, the doctrine of one divine human energy, so he's conflating the two mistakenly, meant to hold fast to the duality of natures, but also wished to obtain again, at least in the sphere of working and willing, that unity which it regarded as imperiled by the decision of the Council of Chalcedon. And it is difficult to tear these apart, because what do you mean one working and one will? And this is some of the difficulty with the language of monoenergism is, what exactly is an energy? And you don't have an explicit essence energy distinction kind of developed in the way that it does get developed further on in the East, but the roots of it are already there. So what exactly does one energy even mean? And I know some historians and commentators that I've looked at have said that this was kept vague on purpose. So part of the point was like, I don't know, energy could kind of mean all sorts of things, but if we keep it vague, it at least will, maybe then it won't be as controversial and everybody can agree on it a little more. But this didn't really work very well. The keeping of things vague did not make people particularly happy. It's kind of like what you find in the Council of Nicaea. The first proposals of a Nicene Creed, or a creed to be agreed upon, doesn't actually answer any of the questions. And by not answering any of the questions, there are some people at Nicaea that say, like, well, we'll just kind of be like really vague and put some pretty basic stuff in there that everyone affirms. And if that's the case, we can just kind of ignore that the differences exist. And that's rejected at the council, right? So those kinds of solutions, solutions that simply kind of ignore the real issues, don't end up actually doing very much to help. This is something that I see in a lot of more contemporary ecumenical discussions and dialogues. So the joint declaration of the Doctrine of Justification, for example, between the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church, is something that I would like to actually do a series of programs on that document and explore it, but it's something that I'm not particularly a fan of, and not because I disagree with a lot of the conclusions in there, but because it just kind of affirms what we already know. Like, it's affirming, okay, we agree on this point, this point, this point. We all knew we agreed on that. It's not really delving into the issues that actually divide us. So sometimes I think it's much more helpful, and I think you see this throughout church history, it's usually more helpful to just acknowledge what the real divisions are instead of trying to make language that just kind of makes everybody happy, because it ends up actually making nobody happy because you don't actually make a decision about what's right and what's not. So I think it's the same kind of dynamic that you see going on here. So the second proposal then, after the monoenergism, say one energy, that is rejected much more quickly than the monothelitism position, because I think this is a little more clear to say, what exactly are we talking about? Monothelitism says there is essentially one will. So there is not a separate human will and a separate divine will. There is the divine human will of Jesus. There is one will rather than two wills. And this position ends up being, as I said, adopted actually by three of the patriarchates in the East and by the Roman bishop, which is really interesting because this ends up being a major issue for the doctrine and the dogma of papal infallibility as it develops in the 19th century with Vatican I in 1870. So let's talk a little bit about exactly what happens there. And this, by the way, I guess I didn't even say what years this is happening in. We're talking 7th century here. So this is a debate that occurs throughout the 7th century. And this is actually going to eventually be resolved in an ecumenical council, just like prior issues were. So at this time, the Byzantine emperor named Heraclius sends out this decree, this letter, and that is in the year 638. And in this letter, he basically says, well, don't talk about the energies thing anymore, because that didn't work, and there's pushback. And so now he says, we're not going to talk about energies anymore, but we are going to say that Christ has one singular will. And this formula is then approved by many patriarchs and theologians. This seems to be like a pretty okay compromise, according to a lot of people that are involved in this controversy. So they're kind of okay saying, all right, well, this is good enough. We're confessing the two natures, one will, as long as that makes the non-Chalcedonians kind of happy. I think we can go with that. The emperor is promoting this, and so we're pretty okay. And so there is then a letter sent, and this is mainly an Eastern controversy. Okay, so this is happening really in the East. The West isn't even really aware at this time of what's going on. The division between East and West at this point has become pretty clear. The lines are very clearly drawn. We have the Byzantine Empire in the East, and the West is not the same, which is fractured a bit at this time. The West tends to be led by the Bishop of Rome and the Church, and you have the five patriarchs in the East, though the Bishop of Constantinople tends to be the most significant. Now, the Bishop of Constantinople at this time, in dealing with this controversy, wants to reach out to the Western Church. So he sends a letter to the Bishop of Rome at the time, which is Pope Honorius I. And Pope Honorius I received a letter which basically endorses the view of monothelitism, saying we're not talking about one energy or two energies at all anymore. We're going to promote this view that Christ has one singular will, and he makes a theological argument there to Pope Honorius, trying to convince him of the veracity of this teaching. And the argument that he makes is basically, well, we don't want to say that Christ has two wills, because if Christ has two wills, that would mean that Christ could actually be in conflict with himself, so that he could have two opposed wills. And that would essentially lead us then down the Nestorian rabbit hole of there being two persons, essentially. If we have a divine will that's against the human will, we've got like two inner persons kind of fighting within Christ. So Honorius thinks that this is compelling enough. He writes a letter back to the Bishop of Constantinople, and he promotes the same doctrine. He says, yes, I think you're right. We should speak of Christ as having only one will. So at this point, we have the leader of the Eastern Church, the Byzantine Emperor, and now the theological leader of the Western Church, all agreeing on something that ends up being condemned as heresy, and that is this view of monothelitism. So these are not insignificant individuals, right? So this is a doctrine that really starts to pick up some steam at this time, and there are theologians that are going to be promoting this, but there still remains some pushback. Then Pope Honorius dies, and we see this a lot of the major figures of the controversy that are promoting, that have the kind of vested political interest in promoting the monothelic perspective, end up dying off. And there is then the next two popes are very blatantly opposed to this notion that Christ has only one will, and promote Dyothelitism, the notion that Christ actually has two wills, distinct from the human and the divine natures. So at that point, these popes start condemning the position that had been endorsed by the bishop in the East and the bishop of Constantinople we're talking about, as well as the emperor. The emperor ends up actually eventually rejecting this idea altogether after the bishop of Constantinople dies, and he says that he was forced to believe it. It wasn't really his fault, which that doesn't seem valid, but he tries to get out of it and say blame it on somebody else, I guess. So at this point, the Western Church pretty unanimously condemns this idea, and there are some discussions in some local synods that discuss it. And at this point, there is a decision to have another ecumenical council to really solve the issue. So now you have East and West divided. The East is divided against itself. So there's a decision to have another ecumenical council to come to a final conclusion surrounding this issue of monothelitism, whether this is a valid theological formulation or not. Now, at this time, this is 680 to 681, so this is the Third Council of Constantinople that gathers together. So at this time, all of the major proponents of monothelitism are gone. So they're not around anymore. So there isn't a significant theological voice that is defending monothelitism that's at the council. Doesn't mean that the idea is not around at all, but its major pushers aren't there. So at the Council of Constantinople, the Third Council of Constantinople, Diothelitism is affirmed, monothelitism is declared a heresy, and along with that, Pope Honorius is called out by name as a heretic and a false teacher. That is what's really significant later. Okay, so that becomes really significant because when we're talking about the authority of the Pope, from a Roman Catholic perspective, the Pope is the one that determines and defends orthodoxy, right? He assures that the church in the West is going to remain orthodox. That's kind of the whole reason people become Roman Catholic, is because they think that Protestantism is too splintered and we're too all over the place doctrinally, and we need some kind of source of authority. So we need the magisterium, which is has its foundation within the office of the papacy. And so Honorius naturally presents some pretty significant problems, because we have a pope that is specifically asked for guidance on an issue that is dividing the church, and in response, he gives his position, which if you believed in papal infallibility as it's declared at the First Vatican Council of 1870, you'd say, well, that's kind of why this exists, because when there's a doctrinal debate in the church, the chair of Peter, is there. So you have the successor of Peter on the throne who can make his ex cathedra pronouncements that this is true and this is not. And clearly that doesn't work in the case of Honorius, because he's asked and he then declares a position which is then later declared to be heresy. Now, this is known. This is very well known throughout the medieval period. There are popes that specifically have to take these vows where they condemn Honorius, that are not going to be a heretic like he was. And then so the reformers love to use this example to say, like, we can't trust the Pope. And I think it's a right example, because it does show that we don't have this kind of infallible seat of authority. In this instance, it's an example of that. That the Pope certainly as well can be led doctrinally astray, even when he is proclaiming something authoritatively. So this shows up again in the 19th century when you have debates about papal infallibility. So in the mid-19th century, when the debates about papal infallibility begin within the Roman Church, there are a lot of Roman Catholics that push strongly against papal infallibility. And this is one of the arguments that Roman Catholics themselves will use. They'll cite this to say, we can't make this decision at this council supporting that because we have clear examples that it's not the case. Now, Rome does have a way of getting around this. Essentially, they say that Honorius is what they call an anti-pope, so he doesn't really count as a pope. He was kind of a fraud in the office. So if you have, this is kind of an easy, to me, it just seems like an obvious out. It's just a way to explain. Rome has ways to explain their ways out of everything. And if you can just call somebody an anti-pope, then it doesn't really matter if a pope is a heretic. That can never disprove your point because you just declare him an anti-pope and it doesn't matter. Who knows? Maybe Francis will be declared an anti-pope in 50 years. And that would solve a lot of issues for Rome and Roman apologists. I don't know. But anyway, that's just an interesting piece of this story that happens there. So, by the way, the Coptic churches in recent history, when they've been asked about monothelitism in some of these discussions, have said they'd never held monothelitism. So it's not like this is even really a perspective that those churches grab onto. It's really just a kind of compromise doctrine that's proposed. It's not like this is some... Unlike a lot of the other Christological issues, it doesn't appear to be some, deeply held belief amongst a lot of the individuals involved in this debate. It really does show up as a doctrine just out of compromise, and that's it. All right, so I'm going to continue reading. I'm going to read some from what Widener says. Okay. So we have then the proposed solution, which is the accepted solution at the Council of Constantinople. And Widener says, the doctrine of Diothelatism, which is what is now considered the Orthodox doctrine. We're not monothelites, we're Diothelites. We believe that there are two wills. The doctrine of Diothelitism drew the consequences of the doctrine of Leo the Great as applied to the will. The doctrine of Leo the Great being the Tome of Leo that we discussed in the last program that we did on Chalcedonian Christology, that there are two natures with distinction, though without blurring and confusion and without separation from one another. So we're saying that insight of Leo is essentially just applied to the will. All right, so this tendency triumphed in the Sixth Ecumenical Council held at Constantinople in 680 AD. So this, by the way, is kind of the last of the great Christological debates. That's not to say that the iconoclast debate doesn't have Christological implications. If you read someone like John of Damascus, I think it's pretty obvious that it was at heart also a Christological controversy. And then you get some adoptionist controversies going on in the Spanish church just after this as well. But of the great Christological controversies in the early church, this is really the last that's clearly and obviously centered on Christology. So you're not really going to have a significant Christological debate of this magnitude until the post-Reformation discussions about the relationship between the two natures, between the Lutheran and Reformed traditions. I think that those debates arise as a result of the fact that those are lingering issues. There are still some lingering issues, even after the six ecumenical councils discussing the relationship between the two natures and who Christ is as divine. There still are questions as to how does the divine nature operate in relation to the human nature. So, and I mentioned this with Chalcedon. Chalcedon it doesn't solve all of the issues. It puts boundaries around orthodoxy, but it doesn't take a strict side on all particulars. And so that's not going to happen until after the Reformation when you have those debates. All right, so the Council at Constantinople says this: we likewise preach two natural wills in him and two natural operations. So they do speak about the energesis will, since that had been brought up, even though that didn't really get as much traction. But it's always good to solve the issue in an ecumenical council until it comes up again. So you can kind of nip it in the bud before it becomes an issue. Two natural operations: undivided, inconvertible, inseparable, unmixed. So same kind of language that you have with the two natures of Christ. And the two natural wills are not contrary. So here you are going to see an affirmation of an important point, that the human will of Christ is aligned with the divine will. So it's not that there is this intense conflict between divine will and human will, which is, again, the argument that was made by some who were defenders of the monothelite idea that, hey, if you don't talk about one will, you can have this idea of wills that are in contradiction, and then you've created two persons, and you're just an historian again. So that clarification is very clearly made. These are not wills that are opposed to one another. But as human will follows the divine will, okay, so the divine will has primacy here. The human will is not, the divine will doesn't do what the human will wants, but instead the human will is in submission to the divine will, and is not resisting or reluctant, but rather subject to his divine and omnipotent will. So it's not resisting. We don't have this, we don't have like the human will of Jesus with a separate personality or something trying to fight against the divine will and loses because the divine will is more powerful. Okay, so important distinctions to make here in qualifications. The dogmatic development of the Greek church was epitomized by John of Damascus, 754. The fame of the last of the Greek fathers as one of the greatest theologians of history rests chiefly on his work entitled The Fount of Knowledge. It is made up of 3 separate and complete books and epitomizes Greek theology. The third and longest, and by far the most important, is an accurate summary of the Orthodox faith. And we see here Widener's nod to John of Damascus. John of Damascus is one of the most significant theologians for the Lutheran tradition. Chemnitz cites him a lot, and within the various Christological debates with the Reformed, John of Damascus plays a very central role, just like Cyril of Alexandria does. So, and I've made this point before, that the Lutheran tradition does tend to be more Eastern in its Christology and its influences than Western in a lot of ways. The Eastern Fathers are very significant for us, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you have this Lutheran tendency among some to have a bit of a love affair with the East, with the Eastern Orthodox, and tend to move east. Instead of moving to Rome, they move to Eastern Orthodoxy. And some of that, I think, is there are some genuine ties between our two traditions, in that we use the Eastern Fathers, we have a very Eastern Christology. We also have, in some ways, a very Eastern sacramental theology in the promotion of mystery, in the way that we speak about the sacraments, rather than the kind of strict scholastic explanations we get in someone like Aquinas. As much as I love Aquinas. Okay, so John of Damascus, though, is a figure that's cited very often, and his exposition of the Orthodox faith, it's a fantastic book. It really is. It's a wonderful text. If you want to read a comprehensive patristic Christology, John of Damascus is the place to go. Because John of Damascus is the one that really systematizes his Christology in light of all of the debates that had already happened. He summarizes the massive development through all of these centuries that we have now of Christological debates. It's summarized extremely well in John of Damascus. So in him, we kind of have the height of all of these developments doctrinally that we've had in terms of the doctrine of Christ. And it's the Eastern Church that has a lot of these debates. So for that reason, it's the Eastern Church that tends to, in some ways, do a little more detailed work on the two natures of Christ, because they're the ones that had to deal with the issues of the non-Chalcedonian churches more so than the West. And by the way, this doesn't mean that there are no churches in the West that are non-Chalcedonian, because there were some of those within the western part of the empire as well. Okay, so then we have some statements from Widener here, getting into some more detail about monothelitism and diothelitism and why one is right and the other is wrong. Monothelitism regards the will as an attribute of person, diothelitism as an attribute of nature. Okay, this is very important because it's already confessed that by orthodoxy, according to Chalcedon, it's confessed that there is one person, two natures. So the question of will can really simply be summarized as, well, what is a will associated with? Is a will associated with a nature, or is a will associated with a person? Does it flow from nature, or does it flow from personality? Now, this is something that is very different in the ancient world than it is today, because in post-Enlightenment thought, we tend to identify human persons themselves with their will. And Enlightenment thought, if you read, Immanuel Kant and onward, there is this strong emphasis on freedom and liberty and personhood. But personhood is kind of encapsulated in your absolute freedom or liberty. So within an American context where I am, we, figures like John Locke, who are the founders of what we call the liberal tradition, have this centering of personhood within freedom. And by freedom, I really mean freedom from constraint or a lack of constraint. And so you can choose what you want to do. That's the essence of what a human person is. And so if you tell somebody you can't do something, then that is an attack on their personhood, because they're associating personhood with freedom. And if I don't have freedom to do X, Y, or Z, you're attacking my person. So that, for example, is why if the discussion of, say, women's ordination comes up, we say, look, Paul seems pretty clear when he's writing to Timothy that there are instructions about the pastoral office being one that is not available to women, but is available to this group of men that meets these particular qualifications. The natural response is that's not fair to women, because what we've done in our culture today is we equate freedom or liberty to make a choice with personhood. So it's an attack on your personhood to say that you can't do something. It's a personal offense, which is why people get really heated, angry about these kind of things. But that's not the way that the ancients tended to think about wills in terms of personhood. They tended to think of will as an outgrowth of nature. And so if will is associated with nature, I think it has a lot of anthropological implications. But you see how that forms how theologians start to speak about the natures of Christ. Now, I will say this, too. If we're talking about God and his will, if you hold to a strong doctrine of divine simplicity, there is an exact union of the divine nature and the divine will. The divine will is not separable from the divine nature. So that the divine will is the divine nature. There are no distinctions in God at all. So if that's the case, certainly you can't have some kind of mingled human divine will, because that's the divine nature. So in a classical approach to a stronger form of simplicity, and I recognize that when you're talking about the Eastern Church and the essence energies distinction, it's not exactly the same. But if you're affirming a strong simplicity in the way that it develops in Aquinas, you can't affirm really a monothelitism unless you say that there is no human will at all, which is certainly a position that could be taken. So if will comes out of nature, if it's the case that will comes from nature, and Jesus has to have a complete and full human nature in order to redeem human nature, because these are the soteriological concerns behind early Christology. It's the concern of, well, Jesus has to, in his incarnation, he has to assume everything that is humanity, because if there's anything he doesn't assume, therefore it cannot be redeemed. And if we are truly redeemed, the only way we're redeemed is by Christ. So if Christ doesn't have anything that belongs to a human nature, that means that he has not healed the aspect of human nature. So if Christ did not have a human will, that means that Christ did not redeem the human will. And if Christ didn't redeem the human will, my human will is not saved, and I'm not saved, and this is a significant theological point. So the difficult thing with this particular debate, though, is it's not like there are all these biblical texts you can go to that parse out the nature of Christ's will. So a lot of it is by implication. So we have the implication, certainly in Scripture, of Christ's full humanity. And so it's a question of when Scripture speaks about Christ's full humanity and the redemption of humanity through his incarnation, does that necessitate that he has a human will? So is a human will part of humanity that Christ needs to have? And the answer, ultimately, that the council comes to is yes, that is absolutely an aspect of humanity that Christ had to assume. And just the broader principle is this: anything that makes a human nature human, that is necessary for a human nature in order to be a human nature, every single one of those things has to be assumed by Christ. Okay, all of them. So that's why we can't speak of Christ as having, say, a human soul, but not a human spirit, if you're going with a tripartite view of the human person. You have to affirm that everything that is human was assumed by Jesus. And so that includes the will. Because I think it's pretty obvious from our natures, looking at an infant and looking at your human struggles against your desires, that our wills are pretty darn fallen. We have wills to supposedly do things that are free, or we like to think of as freedom, but really our wills are enslaved. Right? Our wills are enslaved to our passions. We give in to our base inner animal instincts, even when we rationally know that those decisions are wrong. So our wills are enslaved. We don't have free wills. We have enslaved wills. They are enslaved in sin, and we often make lots and lots of bad decisions. So the reality is, your will is fallen, my will is fallen, and our wills desperately need to be redeemed. So in order for that to happen, Christ has to have a human will in order to redeem that, because our will desperately needs redemption. Mine certainly does. So then we have in Widener, he brings up another point that shows up in John of Damascus, which is a really key contribution that he offers to a lot of these Christological controversies. That really helps to guard against Nestorianism and does this in a way that affirms the unity of natures without denying an essential aspect of nature. And that is this: John of Damascus teaches the anhypostasia, the want of personality of its own of the human nature of Christ. Or more definitely, the anhypostasia, that is, the incorporation or inclusion of the human nature of Jesus in the one divine personality of the Logos. His object was to exclude the idea of a double personality. The personality of the Logos has become also the personality of the human nature. There is but one person in Christ Jesus, but he subsists in two natures. The human nature of Jesus was incorporated into the one personality of the Logos. So, anhypostasia, this idea of the impersonality of the humanity of Christ. So the humanity of Christ is a full and complete human nature, but the humanity of Christ is not a full and complete human person. Because if the humanity of Christ is a complete human person, and you have the Logos making union with a human person, then you cannot say that the Logos is that person. We can't say that the Logos is Jesus. The Logos united with Jesus, but is not Jesus because there's a separate personality of Jesus. And you end up with two Christs. That's Nestorianism. So John of Damascus just clarifies to say we can speak about an impersonality of the humanity of Christ. So that Christ has a personality, but the personality is the Logos. It's not a separate personality. So we have to carefully maintain as carefully as possible, the singular personhood of Christ and the duality of natures in their fullness. And so the Logos, as it's united to the human nature at the conception of Jesus, brings its own personality. So it is the personality of God the Son, specifically, that is united to the humanity of Christ. So we could even say there is a kind of communication of personality. This is how intimate the natures are. And that's what John of Damascus is really good at, is showing the intimacy of this union between the two natures. That we could even say the personhood is communicated from the divinity to the humanity. Which is why we have such a closeness that you can point to Jesus, the human person, and say that is God. It's the intimacy of the two natures coming together in the hypostatic union. And Wider includes here some quotes from John of Damascus, which may be helpful to read to get context of what he's talking about here. Okay, he says this. It does not necessarily follow that the natures that are united to one another in subsistence should each have their own proper subsistence. So by subsistence, we're talking about personality. For after they have come together in one subsistence, both should have one and the same subsistence. For the flesh of God, the Word, did not subsist as an independent subsistence. The flesh of God. I mean, what a cool phrase. Nor did there arise another subsistence besides that of God, the Word. Second quote, for the subsistence of God the Word in itself became the subsistence of the flesh, and accordingly the Word became flesh. So he's grabbing onto that biblical language. The Word became flesh, not the Word united itself to a human person. But there's this intimacy, this realism of became flesh, so that personality now is flesh. Clearly without any change. And likewise, the flesh became Word without alteration, and God became man. For the Word is God, and man is God. Wow. Though having one and the same subsistence, to become flesh is to be united with the flesh, while the Word, having become flesh, means that the very subsistence of the Word became, without change, the subsistence of the flesh. So without change, it becomes the subsistence of the flesh, the personality of the flesh. Then we have another quote here. Widener gives the heading, Christ is a complex person subsisting in two natures inseparably united. So here's what John of Damascus says. For the two natures were united with each other without change or alteration, nor was one compound nature produced out of the two. For we confess that he alike in his divinity and in his humanity both is and is said to be perfect God, the same being, and that he consists of two natures and exists in two natures, we hold that there has been a union of two perfect natures, one divine and one human, not with disorder or confusion or intermixture or commingling, but by synthesis, that is, in subsistence, without change or confusion or alteration or difference or separation. And we confess that in two perfect natures there is but one subsistence of the Son of God incarnate, holding that there is one and the same subsistence belonging to his divinity and his humanity. Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful quotes. And you find these same quotes throughout the writings of John of Damascus. I mean, he's just a really wonderful author. I highly recommend reading him if you're going to be looking at any of the church fathers. I mean, he's one of the first that I would recommend. There's also, he's got a number of quotes here, and I'm not going to get into this too much because we are going to be discussing this as we move further on. But Widener has some quotes on the communication of properties, the communication of attributes here, the perichoretic relationship between the two natures in Christ. And this is the Lutheran approach to Christology says that the properties of the divinity communicate themselves to the humanity of Christ. They communicate to themselves not in such a way that the humanity ceases being humanity. It's a complete humanity, remains a complete humanity. But the union of the Word with the flesh means that the properties of the Word can work themselves in and through the flesh in ways that a normal human nature that is not hypostatically united to the Logos can do. So Christ, for example, can be omnipresent according to his human nature as well as his divine nature because of the unity of person. And John of Damascus is a theologian in his discussion largely of the communication of the personality of the Logos that lays a lot of the groundwork and foundations for what's taught in someone like Martin Chemnitz. So John of Damascus gets a ton of citations from Chemnitz and other early Lutheran authors as well. And John of Damascus speaks about, for example, a deification of the humanity of Christ. Now that comes from Cyril of Alexandria. That's very much Cyril's language. So I'm not going to get into those right now because I think it'll lead us too far astray at this point. And this may be a little shorter than usual, but I don't want to go beyond this because I know if I get to another topic, it will take too long, and I don't want to inadequately address something or start something before getting into really everything that I need to talk about with it. So I hope you found this discussion helpful here. I hope you enjoyed this Christology series. I love Christology. I love talking about early Christology, especially in these debates among the Church Fathers. The history is fascinating. The theology is important. It's practical, even though sometimes it may seem a bit abstract. At least when you get into some of these discussions, it may seem more abstract than some of the earlier ones. But this is a debate that is not discussed nearly as often as we find with Nicaea and the Arian debates, which seem to be a little more clear-cut, probably. So anyway, hope you found this helpful. And if you haven't, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and on your podcast app. And we will see you in the next one. God bless.